I have warned you from this very building for 15 years nearly. Don't confuse me with a liberal. And therefore, I'm going to put my cards on the table. The deportation from Syria to the United States of the two former British citizens, allegedly part of a group of mass murderers and torturers known, alas, alas, as the Beatles, is none of our business. Is none of our business for a number of reasons. First of all, these people are not British citizenship. Their citizenship was withdrawn. It was withdrawn because they had, of their own volition, taken the boats and trains and planes that took hundreds of thousands of foreign jihadists to Iraq and Syria to join the murder gang known as ISIS. That murder gang's depredations amongst millions of people over whom they exercised their rule has been such a blood-soaked and midnight dark chapter in human history that I have no care what happens, no care whatsoever what happens to those who joined it. Because, you see, I know the kind of people who went there, consumed by sectarian hatred, by Islamist fanaticism, so lurid that anyone, even any Muslim, with a different interpretation to their fanatic takfiri blood cult is fair game for torture and murder. Any Christian, especially any Christian cleric, especially any Christian house of worship, any monastery, any nunnery, any church, any priest, any bishop who might fall into their hands was falling into the charnel house that was and is ISIS. These are beasts in human form. Now, I know what this debate will concentrate on. It will concentrate on whether or not, after a trial in the US justice system, these people will be executed, subject to capital punishment. Well, I'm against capital punishment ordinarily, but I'm not against it on the battlefield, and I'm not against it in any and all circumstances. And neither is British law, even were it applicable to these individuals, which it is not. I'm against the death penalty, which is why I hope that every last ISIS and Al-Qaeda fighter and every Jaish al-Islam and every one of the alphabet soup of Islamist fanaticism that our governments have been busily arming, financing, propagandizing for, should lie dead. Not because I think that solves the problem. It is a necessary but not sufficient condition for solving the problem of Islamist fanaticism. It's not sufficient, but it is necessary. And the crushing defeat that these people are facing now in Syria as they faced in Iraq was necessary. Now, I know that I'm already offending many liberal sensibilities, so perhaps I should explain. I don't just know some of the kind of people who went to join ISIS. I know rather more of their victims. I have friends who had to live and some who had to die under their tyranny. I know people who were literally crucified. I know people who were literally beheaded. I know people who had their hearts cut out and eaten on video by these people. So while I'm against the death penalty, don't expect me to mourn the fact that the Nazi beasts at Nuremberg were executed, because there had been a war of choice, a war that ISIS chose to fight, and chose to fight in the manner that they fought it. And that choice rendered them beyond any pale of liberal sensibilities. They're not British. It's not our business where they're tried or what punishment is applied to them if convicted. And it would have been better to have done quick. It would have been better if instead of negotiating buses to move these heart-eaters from one part of Syria after another, to move these head cutters in buses to areas under our control and protection. It would have been better were it done quick and every last one of them dispatched from this earth to the hell fires, to where they surely are bound. Now, that's not the only subject on the agenda today, but I expect it's the one that will generate most heat. But the heat itself is now an issue. Where are these individuals that tell us that rising temperatures in the world are either accidental, coincidental, welcome, or absolutely nothing to do with us? The entire world, virtually, is right now baking dangerously hot. 50 people have been killed in Greece. People are dying of heat stroke. People are being asked in Britain to stay at home and draw their curtains. So deadly is more than 7 consecutive weeks of record temperatures. Now, I lived through, very consciously, the summer of 1976. I even lived through the heat wave, though less consciously, as a 1-year-old baby in 1955. But we have seen nothing like this. And this week in Africa, the highest ever temperature was recorded, 124.5 degrees. This is unsustainable, untenable. The ice is melting. The water is rising. Life at the margins is becoming impossible. And Donald Trump is guilty of many insanities, but a collective, organized, hysterical, and well-funded denial of global warming is just one of them, but one of the more important. On the other hand, tourism chiefs are furious at summer killjoys. Better to be a killjoy than a killer. And red light zones in Leeds. What could possibly go wrong? Well, a surge in drugs and public sex is one thing that could, in fact, has gone wrong. I've had the misfortune to live in and represent Parliament 3 different red light areas. The difference was I was able to use my public office and my voice and my platforms to demand that the police and the justice system enforce the law against curb crawling and against organized prostitution in this country. Again, I can feel the bristles on liberal necks rise. Well, let me tell you, there's nothing progressive about reducing sex to the cash nexus. And when I ask you, as I always do, would you like your daughter to be a prostitute? None of you can truthfully answer yes. And depression, it turns out, amongst new fathers is almost as prevalent as amongst new mothers. And speaking of children, record numbers of children in Britain, aged 10 and 11, are severely obese, fat, unhealthy, and headed for a short and more brutish life than they deserve. It's the mother of all talk shows. Let me give you the number again, 0344 499 1000. You call us and we'll call you back. You can also, of course, tweet the show as Pablo the Hat has. If we compare the situation of radical extremists to the dinosaurs, there are no moderate velociraptors, what I discovered from interviewing imprisoned ISIS fighters. And Bamboleo says, I don't care if these two Beatles get executed. We should really not call them the Beatles, you know, not least because on the 8th of September I'm performing in Liverpool, and it is really such an insult to them. What a waste of money, Bamboleo goes on. Bring them to the US, though. Fix Detroit's water system rather than waste it on these two, making them highly visible martyrs. Or is this the plan? And Lizzie says it's going to be worse next year when the failure of crops hits. Indeed, that's true. You see, some people say, well, they won't get much of a trial in the United States. Well, that's not necessarily true, although it's partly true. But the Nazis didn't get much of a trial at Nuremberg. But it was still right to hang them. It was still right to hang them, not for any specific or particular crime, but for the general crime. The general crime of making aggressive war and supporting and being a part of, collectively and individually, a regime of war criminals. And that is true of every ISIS fighter. Isn't it, my dear Martha? Martha Spurrier, Director of Liberty, good morning and welcome.
Good morning.
Now, what's the current state of thinking at Liberty on this case?
So, Liberty, like the majority of the great British public, are very against the death penalty and proud to say that along with 106 other countries since 1965, we haven't had it in this country. And, you know, there's been a bit of doublespeak here from the politicians, because what they've been saying is if you try and get assurances that the death penalty won't be used, then it will stand in the way of justice. But of course it won't stand in the way of justice, it will just stand in the way of America using the death penalty. And so what we say is, of course, these people who have committed potentially heinous crimes, the worst kinds of crimes, they should be tried, they should be held to account, they should be prosecuted, and they should then serve prison sentences, and probably they should never see the light of day again if they're found guilty. But the fact is that the death penalty is a red line. And once you are the kind of nation who agrees that people should be put to death, then you are into territory of miscarriages of justice, of prejudice and discrimination, and of a culture of violence that just begets more violence, rather than taking the moral high ground and giving people due punishment according to law.
Now, would you have said the same about Hitler and the Nazis?
Yes, we would say the same about everybody, because it is degrading for the executioner as it is for the executed, to say that states will put people to death. What makes us a civilized nation is that we hold values that put us way above the people that try to destroy all of the freedoms that make these kinds of societies great. And so by all means, lock these people up, make sure that they are held to account, forced to be punished day in, day out. You know, prison sentence is no joke. Make them live that for the rest of their lives, make them regret it. But do not stoop so low as to put them to death.
Now, you keep saying the nation, but these people have nothing to do with the nation, do they?
Well, so these two people in particular have been stripped of their British citizenship, and so that's why they, as far as we understand, are in American custody, and it looks like they'll be prosecuted in America. But the fact of the matter is that we owe that obligation to all human beings to say that we don't agree with the death penalty. We don't just not agree with the death penalty for British citizens. That's why, for example, when we deport people, we seek assurances that people won't face the death penalty and that people won't be tortured. Now, by definition, those people we're deporting aren't British citizens, but we, as British people, uphold our values, whoever we're talking about. Otherwise, we'd be hypocrites.
Sure, but then we're deporting them. In this case, these are non-British citizens held by the United States Armed Forces, Special Forces, in Syria. So I'm struggling to see what that's got to do with us.
Well, what it's got to do with us is that America has asked us to share intelligence with them so that we can help with their prosecution. And of course, that's a fairly routine request. We very often will work with our allies to make sure that criminals can be prosecuted. But ordinarily, when we do that, we say that we have certain lines, whether they are British citizens or not. One of those lines is that people will not be put to death. So the fact that America have asked us to share intelligence means that, like it or not, we are now involved in the American justice system. You know, this is what happened during Iraq. We know that Britain turned a blind eye to some of the really terrible practices that America was carrying out, and we have to learn the lessons of that war and how it diminished our standing on the world stage, and we have to now behave in accordance with our principles and say, of course we will share intelligence with you, but on the condition that you will then not put these men to death.
Well, I'm not in second place to you on that point, but these individuals chose to leave our shores and join a gang which arguably is worse than the Nazis who were executed at the end of the Second World War. I don't have to, I know, rehearse to you the heinous nature of the crimes. You already alluded to it. But to take up arms in the army of ISIS, in my view, was an act of war against humanity, and humanity has every right to expect that these people will be dispatched, preferably on the battlefield. I take the view that we will not be safe, even if we kill every ISIS and Al-Qaeda fighter, for others will rise in their stead. But it's not a sufficient condition of resolving this problem to kill them, but it is a necessary one. And I doubt if I'm going to persuade you of that, but last word to you, Martha.
I think it's not necessary because we know that the death penalty doesn't deter people from committing crimes. In fact, it often makes martyrs out of them and it radicalizes other people. And the one thing, as you say, these are the most heinous crimes. They are targeted at the very heart of our societies and our democracies. The one thing that sets us apart from these people is that we have some principles and that we are not hypocrites and we don't divert from those things. So what we must do is we must cleave to our principles, even when it is most difficult to do so, to catch these people, to use everything in our power, to hold them to account, to lock them up, and to make sure that they cannot commit any further crimes in the future. If we go down the road of the death penalty, then we are no better than they are. Mistakes will be made, miscarriages of justice will happen, and we will fuel fear and war and hatred towards our societies for many, many years to come.
Well said. Martha SPURRIER, Director of Liberty, thank you very much for joining us. And you can have your say now on this most vexatious of subjects. 87222 is the number to text. You put the word talk and then follow it with your message. You can, of course, tweet me at George Galloway at Talk Radio. You can ring me 0344 499 1000. I'm not against the death penalty in all circumstances. frankly, to suggest that we should not have executed Adolf Hitler if we had been able to get our hands on him is absurd. It's taking liberalism to the point of absolute absurdity. To say that Adolf Eichmann or Hermann Göring or the commandants of Auschwitz, Buchenwald, Belsen, Treblinka, and all these death camps should not have been executed if and whenever, by the way, whenever they fell into our hands, is taking liberalism to the point of absurdity. It was mildly unsettling to be lectured by a young woman who probably doesn't even know my role in opposing the war in Iraq, which of course led to many of these excrescences in the first place. It was a bit unsettling to be lectured by a young woman who probably doesn't even know what I did when faced with that. But I will not be morally blackmailed by shirking from our duty to take the war, to take the fight to ISIS and Al-Qaeda and people like them, because these people are still trying to murder us. And until we've defeated them, we will live in permanent danger. It's George Galloway in for Mike Graham. Between 10 and 1 a.m., Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, for this week only. Back again on Friday evening with the real mother of all talk shows at 7 p.m. But the number is always the same, 0344 499 1000.
The mother of all talk shows with George Galloway on Talk Radio. We'll get you talking.
Now, it always amazes me the kind of things that people regard as progressive. Euthanasia, abortion, legalizing prostitution, legalizing drugs. These are all part of the leitmotif of liberalism, progressivism these days, and all of them leave me absolutely cold. Perhaps I'm sorry to say, perhaps I'm not, but I'd be a liar if I said otherwise. Therefore, if I'd been a Leeds Member of Parliament, I would have opposed the opening of Britain's first legal red light zone. I know the arguments in favour. I also know the reality that comes in the wake of such things. I'm told, admittedly by the Daily Mail, on page 8 today, that the red light zone, legal one in Leeds, has led to a surge in drug taking and public sex. But there is another point of view, and I'm joined by Catherine Stevens of the International Union of Sex Workers. Catherine, welcome.
Hi, thanks very much for having us all.
Did you welcome the creation of this zone, and how do you think it's working out?
We did. We did welcome the creation of the zone, and I think when in your introduction you were talking about this as a kind of liberal, progressive idea, and the reason we welcome this isn't because of a political point of view or an ideology. It's because we talk about making policy based on evidence and doing what is most effective in terms of solving problems. And actually, decriminalisation, which is not the situation in Leeds, that's the national case anymore, but decriminalisation and offering support to people in the sex industry as if they're part of the community is what's most effective in solving the problems associated with the sex industry.
So you call it an industry, and of course it is an industry, and not just in the obvious way that you and I are talking about, but sex sells much in this late stage of capitalism, and of course there's a gigantic pornography industry and so on. So I'm not approaching this from the point of view of naivety. But Catherine, you're the head of, or rather speaking for, a union of sex workers.
Yeah.
Do you regard prostitution, therefore, as work like any other work, like I'm doing now, for example?
Well, obviously, every job is different. So I've never met a sex worker's rights. It's a job just like any other. But like every job, actually...
You know what, Catherine? This is too important a discussion, and you too eloquent a spokesperson to continue on a bad line. So we'll get back to you if we may. And let me read some more of the messages. Craig says, I'm not against the death penalty, but in this case, I feel life in a maximum security prison in the USA will be a living hell. Death will come. On another note, I love listening to you. I differ in political opinions, but I always loved you as an MP rattling the cage of the establishment. For the first time in my life, I cannot vote in the next election, as I am opposed to all the parties. What a shame. Please get back into Parliament. Keep up the good work. All the best, Craig. Thanks for that, Craig. Martha Spurrier from Liberty stated that the majority of British people are against the death penalty. Where did she get this information from? The two Daesh terrorists deserve whichever sentence the American courts decide to impose. That's from Stephen Broadhead on Twitter. Lizzie on Twitter says, you sounded surprised when the fellow said he's not a Jew. That is the crux of the matter concerning anti-Semitism. Labour Party members who aren't Jewish are afraid to speak for fear of being labelled anti-Semitic and being thrown out of the Labour Party. And Fra says people who commit crimes in Syria against Syrian nationals and others must be handed over to face the rigours of the law in the land where these crimes were committed, including the white helmets. Well, that's very interesting that you say that, Fra, because you've just written to me opposing the death penalty. But I can assure you, if they were tried and convicted in Syria, they would face the death penalty. And would you be against it then also? Or is it just that it might be applied in the United States that you are against? Are you against it in principle, or are you against it just because of the circumstances of this case? I should add that these two individuals are sought for trial in the United States because they are alleged to have murdered American citizens. And in fact, it is undeniable that they were part of an armed group that was rampaging through the lives not just of Syrian and Iraqi people, but murdering foreigners at will. Let's take a call from John in East Lancs. Go ahead, John.
Good morning, Joe.
Good morning.
Yeah, I'm just inquiring. The death penalty. Don't we need more prisons to house these so-called, these IS terrorists in the comfortable surroundings that they would be entitled to?
Well, they're going to the United States. They're not wanted for, apparently. No. They're not wanted, apparently. I don't quite know why, by the British state for their part in the alleged murders of British citizens. But they are wanted in the United States, and the United States has custody of them.
Right, I'm just saying with the recent, there's a hell of a lot of terrorists out there, and if we start saying, oh, well, we'll have to put them in prison, how many prisons do you think we'll need?
Well, a lot more than we've currently got, because there are thousands, tens of thousands of these people around the world. And we should know that, because we've been giving them weapons. We've been giving them money. We've been propagandizing for them day and night, every day and night, for many years, on our televisions, radios, and in our newspapers. So we know very well there are tens of thousands of them, because this is a monster that we helped to create.
That's right, yeah. So really, the people, if we start going down this line, I mean, who's going to benefit? The human rights lawyers? I just find it bizarre that we're even talking about it.
Yeah, I'm a bit surprised at how it's suddenly flared up, and all these people, Keir Starmer, for example, who urged on, who egged on the bombing, rocketing, invasion and occupation of these very countries by his own country, is outraged at the fact that two of the terrorists might get tried and executed in the United States. I just find that completely bizarre. It's where liberalism disappears up its own fundament.
Exactly, George, exactly.
John, you're a gentleman. Thank you very much indeed for that call. 0344 499 1000. I'm still trying to get our guest back to continue that discussion about sex work. Let me go on with the messages. David says, sorry, George, can't support your view on the death penalty for these excuse for humans. I go along with David Cooper. It is not compassionate to show compassion to the enemies of compassion, but I stand with the mother of all talk shows. Thank you, David. Scouse Alarm, my old pal up in Liverpool, says, I always thought I was against the death penalty, but when I read about the heinous crimes such as terrorism, paedophilia and cold-blooded murder, I always end up wishing death on the perpetrators. Many other people I know feel the same. Let me just segue for a minute, Scouser. There was a guy sentenced yesterday who terrorised all of southeast London, including my own family living there, over a whole year, sexually assaulting young children as young as 8 years old, and then running off. Everybody, every school girl and their parents was terrified of this man, and he was sentenced yesterday to 6 years in prison, and he'll be eligible for parole in 36 months. In 36 months, he'll be eligible to be back out on the streets of southeast London. This is an outrage. The whole issue of sentencing and the severity with which these utterly aberrant perverts are dealt with in the British courts, as well as the extraordinary randomness of the punishments that are held out. If you're an Eastern European jewel thief, you'll go to prison for more years than you can count. You'll be lucky ever to come out. But if you go around southeast London sexually assaulting women and girls on a daily basis, sometimes in broad daylight, well, you'll be out before you could say Jack Robinson. By the way, this fellow wasn't a Muslim, was he? Asking for a cellmate. Get my drift? And Lizzie says, I personally would have trouble condemning anyone without absolute proof. But I get your point about if you actually join ISIS, you are culpable for their actions. Of course you are. If you are a Nazi, you willfully join the Nazi Holocaust machine. If you are a part of a movement that murders people in their millions in a racist rampage, if you are a part of a movement that murders disabled people, mentally ill people, homosexual people, people because of their political opinions, people because they're Jews, if you're a part of that, where are your human rights in the aftermath when you are defeated? What civil liberties do you deserve in the aftermath of your activities being defeated? I'm very clear. For me, the only good fascist is a dead fascist. And ISIS and Al-Qaeda are a kind of fascism. You know my view on how it came to be. You know my view on what needs to happen in order to stop it being again. But that doesn't mean that when today's fascists fall into your hands, you hand them the full Liberty playbook. Sorry, not me. 0344 499 1000. That's the number to call. Danny says, this year I went to the south coast of Devon with my family. It was better than any abroad holiday I've ever had. I wouldn't go abroad if we were guaranteed this weather every year, although it was a long car journey from Glasgow. And Bob says, so Liberals and the mainstream media frame a debate about ISIS fighters facing the death penalty. Funny timing, considering we've been told the ISIS ambulance service and part-time actors, the White Helmets, are being brought to the UK. They won't mind them living next door. Very good point, Bob, and one which we dealt with yesterday. We're actually about to take up to 800 of these ISIS and Al-Qaeda head choppers into Britain. Indeed, hundreds of these head choppers are already back here, and nobody did anything about it. Nobody even properly counted them, never mind monitoring them. Jimmy says, day of work today, got Mr. George Galloway on talk radio. Then the football tonight. What football's on tonight, by the way? I am with you, George. My two daughters like Colwyn Bay in North Wales because of the zoo. The zoo is a fine draw for the kids, I must say. My little boy is demanding to be taken to Tigerland, he calls it, Tiger Rock at Whipsnade. I'm definitely going to have to do that sometime very soon. Is that me? Is that meant to be me? 0344 499 1000. I shall henceforth instruct all my children to call me Daddy. Cool. Now, Chris says this country's morality is going down the toilet in the name of so-called progress. But what in God's name are we progressing towards? And Ash asks of prostitution, isn't it the oldest profession in the world? Well, Ash, I just ask you, and I ask everybody. I've done it for almost 15 years now in this very building. Would you like your daughter to be a prostitute? And if the answer is no, as in your heart you know that it's no, then don't tell me it's a profession. Don't tell me it's work, just like any other work. So much here. I'm struggling with it. I used to think George Galloway was at the opposite end of the political spectrum for me. Then I listened to him on talk radio and agree with so much of what he says. Am I shifting to the left, or is he slipping rightwards? Hope it's the latter. It's definitely not the latter, Fuzzy, but it's caused by a misunderstanding between my political position and liberalism. I am not now, nor have I ever been, a liberal. I don't believe in license. I believe in the words of me and Bobby McGee that freedom's just another word for nothing left to lose. I believe in order, in discipline, in a state, a strong state. I believe that a moral code should prevail in all of our legislation and indeed in all of our lives. That doesn't make me right-wing. That makes me what I have always been. And it certainly means I'm not a liberal. Abicat says, when is the Conservative government going to investigate the amount of money flowing into the Remain camp from George Soros and take action against UK citizens that are conspiring with this foreign national and accepting funding from him? Well, this is absolutely correct. And let me tell you that a mass murderer speaks on social media today. Tony Blair has released a video telling you why Brexit must be scrapped and a new referendum must be held. Now, the same Tony Blair yesterday revealed that he signed a £9 million a year deal with the dictatorship of Saudi Arabia in exchange for his advice. Expensive advice, you may think. So, let me run that past you again. Saudi Arabia is giving £10 million a year to Tony Blair, and Tony Blair is giving money to the Remain camp. Ergo, Saudi money is now helping to fuel the scrap Brexit campaign. Do you get my drift? Here's John in Gravesend. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, very good morning to you, George.
And you.
So I'm very similar with the moral code principle that you've outlined. The problem I've got is with an English-speaking foreign powers moral code. And I am worried that this slippery slope will lead ultimately to the handing over of Julian Assange. And then the Americans will say, well, you enjoyed it the first time, watch it the second time. I mean, we will even hand over 440 of our own troops, like Smarties, in Afghanistan to please our American masters.
Yeah.
I just don't.
Well, I do think
treaty,
John, of course I understand the point that you're making, but it's not comparing apples with oranges. And that's what you're doing here. Julian Assange is guilty of no crime. He did not put on an ISIS uniform and cut people's heads off. He revealed the crimes that were being committed. As a journalist, he revealed things that we now take for granted as common knowledge, but which we would never have known if it were not for Julian Assange. Now,
you are 100% correct. I fully agree. But you're putting Julian Assange on the same slope, sliding down it potentially. American congressmen have made no secret of the fact that they wish him killed.
Yes, indeed. And there is a real possibility that this man who's in our custody, if extradited to the United States, might be killed. And that's one of the reasons, though only one of them, why he must not be extradited. Because he's here in Britain, in our hands. The ISIS terrorists are not in Britain, and they are not in our hands. And therefore, this argument is odious because they have nothing to do with us.
But America always tells us how high to jump, and we jump. You know, if we want a trade deal, we'd like some men in Afghanistan. When British soldiers were died under friendly fire, which country refused to attend the Coroner's Courts in Oxford? The Americans, our so-called friends. Now, as far as I'm concerned, English-speaking foreign power, treat them as that. They're nothing special. Their own moral code. I mean, what sort of court would they be tried in, or even Assange? You know, I just don't like our government handing over our people to a foreign power.
They're not our people.
Yeah, but the next people to be extradited will be possibly our own.
But no, I led the parliamentary campaign against the extraditing of a South London man to face trial in the United States on trumped-up, bogus terrorism charges.
Yeah.
I am completely opposed to Britain extraditing people to the United States without proper due cause evidence being presented. David Blunkett signed an extradition treaty between Britain and the United States in the middle of summer with no parliamentary scrutiny whatsoever, which allowed America to have extradited to it people without even having to show cause for that extradition. And I opposed it. I opposed it.
Yeah,
What I urge you with all my heart, as someone who loves Julian Assange like a brother, don't mix Assange up with these bloodthirsty, blood-drinking demons. They are demons.
A weak, wet British government that licks American backsides at every opportunity.
Well, I'll see you on the picket line, John. Thanks very much for your call. Joe says, George, there's no scorcher up here in Liverpool. At present, it's 20 degrees centigrade, and the average temperature through to August around 25. Well, it's 35 here, Joe. So say hallelujah. I promise you, 25 is better than 35, at least in the city. Now, we've toured the horizon. We've talked about the record temperatures that are scorching the earth. We've talked about the scorched earth of Syria and Iraq at the hands not just of ISIS and Al-Qaeda and their ilk, but of foreign invaders of all kinds. We've talked about postnatal depression in men. Who'd have thunk it? And we tried to talk, and hope again tomorrow to talk about the legalised red light zone in Leeds. What could possibly go wrong with that? But that doesn't mean that the last of our subjects, or actually the penultimate one, is any less important than all of the preceding. Record numbers of children aged 10 and 11 in Britain are severely obese. Tam Fry is the head of the National Obesity Forum, and he joins me now. Tam, welcome.
Good afternoon to you.
These are very shocking statistics that I saw in the newspaper this morning. Talk us through the scale of this problem, will you?
Well, they're absolutely tragic. These children, and they're somewhere in the order of 27,000 children a year, are getting to a level where they are prime opportunity for diabetes acquisition, for heart problems, for cancers, for kidney problems, for strokes. They are so fat that they really are in jeopardy of dying much earlier than the normal population.
27,000 a year, 10 and 11-year-olds.
Yes. And, of course, those are just the absolute top.
Yes.
But there are tens of thousands of children who are still in the danger area because they are between being overweight and severely overweight.
Now, in the past, I'm talking in the Dickensian past, poor people were thin and rich people were fat. And now that's reversed, isn't it?
It has indeed, it is unbelievable that it is so. The poor people, if you will, the families with a low income possibility, are having to subsist on food which is less than healthy. It is food which is stuffed full of fat, sugar, and salt. Those are the three ingredients which most dispose towards obesity, and they are caught in a trap. Because, unfortunately, healthier food, although it may not necessarily be as expensive or as cheap everywhere else, is more difficult to find. So the people who are poor income, poor on time, really have got very little option other than to consume ready-made food and fast food, which is just plain unhealthy.
It's also that children gravitate to that kind of food and indeed are intended to, isn't it? With
Yes.
my own children, for example, I can try stuffing broccoli spears in their mouth, but they'd rather have the chips.
Absolutely. And of course, that is another real problem which we have to overcome. The foods which are high in fat and sugar are tasty and smell delicious. And that is what gets the children. And the advertisers know that full well, and so they play on it. And you can hardly go 10 yards down a high street in any town in the country without actually smelling the fast food shops, and children are drawn to it.
Now, when did this begin to accelerate, Tam, if I think back to my own school days, with shame, actually, there were one or two fat boys in the class, and I still remember their names. They were Tubby this and Fatty that, but they were not the norm. They were exceptional. When did it become the case that so many of our children were fat?
There is a point, and the point is 1989. Okay. In 1989, the senior pediatricians from the Royal College of Pediatrics and Child Health decided that there was no evidence which showed that measuring children taking their weight was of any lasting benefit. And that is the moment where they took their eye off the ball. And from that time, which is nearly 30 years ago, children have been left, if you will, to pile on the pounds without being monitored. And that is seen in the literature, it's seen in the research that the escalation took off at that point and has been increasing steadily ever since.
It's not just what's going in, it's what isn't going out, isn't it, Tam? If you are eating a lot, you need to work a lot. You need to, I mean, once upon a time, of course, millions, tens of millions of us did physical work for a living, and children played outside, running around all evening after school and had to be dragged in. Both of these things no longer obtain.
Absolutely, and in parallel with with what I've just been talking about, came the revolution in electronic technology, and the iPhones and the iPads and the computers and the video games started to come in with a vengeance in the 90s. So what you had was a double whammy. You had people, children particularly, eating too much of the wrong food and staying in their bedrooms, staying on the couch, playing with these instruments, which were fascinating. And of course, because they were fascinating, children enjoyed using them, and they would play on them till kingdom come, because what is so boring, in their words, is going out and running around. We would much rather be stuck with our computery.
That's one issue, boring. But there's also the issue that for many kids there isn't the same space and place and opportunity to run around. No ball games here, playing fields sold off, spare land developed, luxury housing, too many cars in the street, and so on. It's really a triple whammy, isn't it?
It is, in fact, a triple or even quadruple whammy, because the one thing you haven't mentioned is the parks, local parks, which were beautifully designed and instigated by the Victorians and Edwardians, have been left over the years to rack and ruin.
Yeah.
And those are the parks which were intended for people to go and let off steam and have recreation, and now they're virtually inaccessible because, unfortunately, at the same time, the parks are being populated by people who parents would prefer that their children were not contacted by.
You see, that last point is a very powerful one. There are parks, of course, even in our debased times. It's not usually possible to build luxury housing on our parks. But the process you just described, rather gently, I'll describe more bluntly. In a park where people are taking drugs, where people are potentially molesting children, where glass is scattered around and debris of all kinds, parents feel that it isn't safe for their children to run around. Now, again, back to when I was young, there was somebody called a park ranger. In fact, there were loads of park rangers, the parquet we called them, and people were afraid to misbehave in parks, to ruin the park, because the park ranger would find you. A little bit of investment in a new generation of park rangers could rehabilitate these parks.
Well, that was something which was proposed to the government in 2015 by the local government association. What the association wanted was 20% of the VAT returns from the Treasury in order that they could reinvest in the parks, to clean them up, to man them, to make them attractive, just as they were left by the Victorians and the Edwardians. And unfortunately, the government refused to give them the powers to do that or the money.
Well, unfortunate, to say the least. Now, your National Obesity Forum, Tam, would you tell me something about that? Because I think a lot of the listeners would like to key into your work.
Well, essentially, the forum is an association of like-minded specialists who, in 2000, were horrified at the escalating levels of obesity. And they give their work pro bono. They come from all walks of life. They are medical professionals as well as being common Joes like you and I, if you'll excuse me saying that. And what they are doing is to try in their own way to make sure that their specialty gets to the government and says enough is enough, because we have now got to such a level that it could sink the NHS, because the money which we are spending is something in the order of £27 billion a year for the overall effect of obesity. Wow. Now, that is government figures. Government actually say this themselves, and I cannot believe how the Chancellor of the Exchequer can be losing all that money without actually banging the table in number 10 and saying you've got to do something about this and quick.
So many of these things come back to a stitch in time saving 9. For a mere fraction of that number you've just mentioned, this problem could be markedly reduced and the lives of the people afflicted markedly improved.
I totally agree. And I am just dumbfounded at the inaction from Westminster, who on its own admission, knows that that is the sum of money which we are losing on a yearly basis. And the problem is that it's going to increase until some dramatic action is not taken. David Cameron, before he left Downing Street, said obesity is going to be his number one priority. He called it a great tragedy. He said what was needed was robust, strict measures, and unfortunately he was ousted from Downing Street before he could put them into place, and the new tenant, Theresa May, in my view, has not done a very good job for his legacy.
I can't tell you how much I admire you, Tam, and I recommend everyone look for the Obesity Forum. How do they find it online?
www.nationalobesityforum.org, and you will find loads of material there. Unfortunately, we are so busy we don't always keep our website up to date. That's an error that we have made, because even today, this is my 5th radio interview today, and I have to be overseeing that as well. So I'm looking forward to going home, sitting down with a glass of water and saying, how do we update our website?
Tam Fry, he's the head, in fact, of the National Obesity Forum. That's nationalobesityforum.org, I think he said. Check it out. I certainly will be. Thanks very much for joining us.